Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. I'm Andrew Tillett. I'm a director of the National Press Club here in Canberra and also a political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. Today's guest is President of the Australian Local Government Association, Linda Scott. We've got ALGA's national conferences in Canberra this week. Very good timing given the events with the National Party leadership and the importance of that to Bush councils. The good news is none of these councillors here for their annual meeting have to deal with anything about barking dogs or neighbourhood fence disputes or anything like that. But Linda here, she's the former Deputy Mayor of the City of Sydney and a current serving councillor at the city, and the first female president of ALGA. And her address today is entitled Local Government Leading Strong Community-Centric Recovery. So everyone, please welcome Linda Scott to the stage.
Thanks so much. It's a true honour to be here. I'd of course like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on the land of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And remember that under this beautiful building here in Canberra is their land. There's a line in Lewis Carroll's Looking Through the Looking Glass when the White Queen advises Alice to practice believing impossible things. Sometimes she tells Alice, "I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." There were times during the 97 weeks in March 2020 where it felt like we collectively had done 6 things impossible before breakfast. As a nation, we of course blew past accepted wisdom on what governments could and couldn't achieve. In a matter of weeks, we solved problems that had been previously absolutely considered intractable. We did things considered impossible. Affordable childcare, for so long in the too hard basket, was suddenly not just affordable, but free. The federal government doubled the job seeker rate and lifted more than 400,000 Australians out of poverty overnight. In Sydney, we worked with the state government to see 3,732 rough sleepers provided accommodation within the space of a week. Parents and carers across the nation who had been long calling for more flexibility in start and finish times suddenly found themselves working from home, their entire office in their lounge room. There were, of course, emergency measures put in place in a time of crisis, but they, of course, are not perfect and, unfortunately, also not particularly sustainable. Preventing childcare centres from charging fees without helping them with any fixed costs, in the case of our local government centres who didn't receive JobKeeper, couldn't find a way to pay for wages and food. It was a stressful time, to say the least, when we faced more than 500 childcare centres run by our councils closing down overnight. Putting rough sleepers in a 4-star hotel is not a sustainable solution, and less than 1,000 of those rough sleepers housed in Sydney have been provided with ongoing housing. Most employers and most employees also want some face-to-face time in the office, and our cities certainly need that to thrive. But if we can learn one thing from the year of living impossibly, aside from the fact that my children love to prank me on Zoom calls by placing a toy spider in a plate of snacks, many of you were on that Zoom call at the time, and I do apologise for my language. I hope we can all learn to solve problems a little bit better as a result. And of course, in my role as the ALGA president, I hope to see Australians expecting governments to solve problems more readily as a result of how we all did so well during the pandemic. This might sound like an idea on the progressive side of politics, and I am on that side of politics. But in local government, knowing government can solve community problems is indeed very bipartisan. It's what we do. We don't do foreign policy, we don't do free trade agreements, we don't do finance sector reform. We, of course, do roads, rates and rubbish. We do pools, parks and playgrounds. We do libraries, local festivals and lighting. We employ lawyers, labourers, librarians, cleaners, carpenters and carers, electricians, engineers and educators. We employ nearly every vocation in Australia. I'm not going to tell a room full of journalists and mayors that all council meetings are peaceful or harmonious. They're not. We're all elected by people with differing priorities who represent different issues. That's our responsibility. But if I've learnt one thing from local government, it's that when we work collectively, we can often find a solution that meets all our needs. The example I'm going to provide is with the humble light bulb. As many of you would know, LED light bulbs use less electricity. They're cheaper to run and they produce less emissions. They also give a brighter light. Around the country, councils are working together, in some places with support from state or territory governments, to meet the upfront costs to transition our streetlights to LED. One example is the fantastic Light Years Ahead project, where councils in Western Sydney are working together to replace nearly 15,000 mercury vapour lights with LED lighting. That's reduced energy consumption by nearly 4.5 million kilowatts per year, reducing energy costs by 77%. Some mayors are motivated and tell their community they're doing this to save money. Others tell their communities they're doing this to reduce emissions. Still others are interested and tell their communities they're doing this to bring more safety to their communities. Regardless of the why, regardless of the policy or political persuasion, they're all working together, getting on with the job to create the same triple bottom line solution. Ultimately, we're all working as good governments to solve problems of our communities. Another thing that helps foster collaboration and cooperation in local government is that a huge amount of what we do is loved by everyone, no matter how they vote. In 2018, as local councils across my state of New South Wales struggled with significant cuts to our public library funding, more than 90 councils of many different political persuasions came together with the New South Wales Public Libraries Association and more than 12,000 community supporters, and together we called for more state government for funding for public libraries. Surprisingly, during a by-election, the New South Wales Government agreed, gave our public libraries an extra $60 million over 4 years. No mayor is ever going to get booted out of office for spending more on public libraries. It's a great moment of collective, non-partisan action in defence of beautiful public institutions, public libraries. And it illustrates one of the big problems local governments face that we can't solve. We have very, very little funding. We hear a lot about the vertical fiscal imbalance when it comes to Commonwealth and states and territories. But let me tell you, if you want to see the pointy end of vertical fiscal imbalance, take a look at your local council's attempts to keep a library open 7 days a week, run affordable childcare to the highest early learning standards, maintain thousands and thousands of kilometres of roads and footpaths. Some of our councils here in the room today are doing that with a rate base of less than 6,000 people. Unfortunately, financial assistance grants have declined, the main mechanism for councils to be funded, from 1% of Commonwealth taxation revenue in 1996 to about half that now. Our ability to generate our own income through hiring out council-owned facilities like campgrounds or caravan parks varies extremely widely from one local government area to another. The quality of the services you can access should not depend on the postcode that you live in, but sadly, without secure and sufficient funding for local government, this is of course the reality for so many Australians. For more than 100 of Australia's 537 local governments, the pandemic came hard on the heels of the impact of the Black Summer bushfires. That included many, indeed many here today, who had been most severely affected also by a significant drought. Council resources were strained. For others, the COVID restrictions had an immediate and dramatic effect on our budgets, crashing our income in obvious ways. If the museum is closed, you're not buying a ticket. If you're running an airport, as they do in Dubbo and many local governments do across the state, you're losing $2 million in the last financial year. While that's not much in the context of a Commonwealth budget, for councils, that is sometimes the difference between liquidity and not. All this happened at a time when our communities needed us to step up and help them through an extraordinarily challenging time. And, of course, despite the financial hits that we were all taking, I'm so proud to say that local governments did. My own council in the City of Sydney provided a $72.5 million package of support despite a significant similar level of income reduction. I'm running to be the City of Sydney's next Lord Mayor, and if I was elected, I would donate my entire salary for my first term to support local charities and community groups who have and continue to be doing it so tough as part of this pandemic. On the other side of the country to us, the Western Australian Local Government Association provided more than $250 million in relief for rates, fees, charges and rents as a result of the pandemic, as part of a $512 million support package. Their marketplace online facility saw local government direct more than $40 million to COVID-affected small businesses through direct procurement. Across Western Australia, local governments contributed more than $200 million in additional capital and maintenance works in support of the economy during the pandemic, creating jobs, leaving a legacy of services and infrastructure for the public benefit. Tasmanian councils provided more than $40 million in relief measures. Despite the enormous hit in the first, second and many other waves in Melbourne, the City of Melbourne has contributed more than $50 million to their Central City Reactivation Fund. It's been inspiring and humbling to be the president of the Australian Local Government Association and see the agility, the innovation and the dedication of mayors, councillors and council staff across the nation. Local communities have such different needs despite the very global nature of this pandemic. Waverley Council took 30 additional casual staff, all those stood down from Qantas, as COVID-safe marshals for Bondi Beach. Broken Hill, obviously, does not need beach patrols, but their nearest tertiary hospital is in Adelaide, which is of course across a state border. The Mayor of Broken Hill, Daria Turley, as luck had it, works for New South Wales Health, and so her job as Mayor became facilitating urgent medical transfers for most of 2020. In the same way, recovery is going to need to be led locally. Different regions are and have been and will be differently affected by quarantine leaks, associated lockdowns and exposure sites. Add to that the lumpy recovery as different sectors of the economy come back at different speeds. The Lismore campus, for example, of Southern Cross University employs more than 2,000 people. Lismore needs a recovery plan that supports those people and that campus. Mareeba in far north Queensland is a music and performing arts hotspot. Mareeba Shire needs a recovery plan that takes that into account. One-size-fits-all economic solutions leave too many behind. We know, though, that we can find these local solutions for our communities, and we can do that through great local government, who is better placed than any other level of government, indeed than anyone else, to do this best. We've been doing it, not during the pandemic, but all along. One of Australia's smallest shires, the Wudjil Aboriginal community on Cape York Peninsula, work to ensure, for example, the safety of their community through a weather-resistant, independently solar-panelled, hotspot telecommunications backup. That sounds like a very complex thing. It's basically an alarm. It's a tidal wave and tsunami warning system that works during cyclones. It's life-saving, but it wouldn't obviously make a lot of sense in somewhere like Alice Springs. The Regional Council, however, in Alice Springs, in McDonald Ranges Regional Council, delivers a program called MaxSafe in 12 remote communities, transporting children home or to a safe location at night. They also run MacYouth with a range of youth programs. In the year 2019-2020, they took just under 15,000 young people to a safe location at night, delivered 13,000 hours of sport and recreation, jobs, education and other youth programs. They deliver these and other services through a team of 300 people, 83% of whom are Aboriginal. We know as councils what our communities need and how to deliver it. We are place-based there, on the ground, agile and connected deeply to our local communities. We're best placed to identify problems and so often well placed to come up with solutions. But what we can't do is fund them. We can't fund them, certainly, by ourselves, because, sadly, we are not awash with cash. We have not actually recognised our level of government in the Constitution. And indeed, sadly, when we played up the hill this morning, soccer against the parliamentarians, it was a regular sledge against us. We're not actually recognised, of course, as a level of government by the Constitution, and we do need constitutional recognition to progress. I do want to make very clear, though, that the position of ALGA is to ensure that constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament for Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people, in line with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, must take absolute precedence over this issue. It brings me back again to what local governments can do to solve big national problems. There's a national Closing the Gap agreement, with states and territories working in partnership with the coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations. The Australian local government is very proud to be part of that agreement, but local governments are captured in our state government implementation plans. There is no formal, separate mechanism for individual councils to take part. Yet, regional councils, many of them, are doing this, especially in the Northern Territory, where they are absolutely critical to providing services for our remote Aboriginal communities. It's great to see some friends of ours from East Arnhem Regional Council here today, but right across the country there is extremely innovative work happening by local governments to take practical measures to close the gap. Early childhood care and development, housing, disability inclusion, community infrastructure, and so much more. Indeed, in this space, metropolitan councils are often falling behind. I'd absolutely be committed to introducing a City of Sydney Close the Gap plan to ensure that metropolitan councils learn and adopt the wonderful strategies that we've seen work so effectively across our regions to address closing the gap properly, formally. We just need to be part of the formal process for responding to the pandemic as well. One of the disappointing things in the management of the pandemic has been the exclusion of local government from National Cabinet. To a certain degree, we understood at the beginning when the Prime Minister abolished COAG, something that ALGA had been a foundation member of, and created the National Cabinet to respond to a health crisis. However, over time, it's become increasingly apparent that local government absolutely needs to be on the National Cabinet. Of course, we don't control national or state borders. We don't have quarantine powers under the Constitution. We don't have any powers under the Constitution. We don't run hospitals. But it's been nearly 18 months. We've moved on now from worrying about flattening the curve to vaccination rollouts and recovery plans. Local councils already have facilities. We could have repurposed them into mass vaccination centres. In South Australia, childhood immunisations are already delivered in clinics run by local government. In New South Wales and Victoria, we already employ community nurses. We have resources, local knowledge and deep connections to our local community to ensure a more successful rollout of vaccines. We've also played a crucial role in the recovery, economically. Together, councils employ nearly 200,000 people. We spend nearly $40 billion each year. More than 70% of our councils are rural, remote or regional. Regional councils alone invest $12 billion per annum in Australia's regional communities. Across Australia, we employ thousands of apprentices and trainees in diverse areas: agriculture, technology, financial services, transport, automotive services, engineering, hospitality, construction. If we had a more secure base, we could hire more apprentices, solving Australia's skills shortages in a considerable way. We are crying out for proper funding to employ more childcare workers, business service workers, landscapers, community service workers, plumbers, librarians, painters, tilers, carpenters and more. As major procurers, of course, we're also best placed to play a key role in developing plans to support jobs and strengthen our local supply chains. $39 billion worth. Just in our ordinary day-to-day operations, local governments buy workwear and protective equipment, tyres, batteries, every kind of industrial and construction material you can imagine. Vehicles, machinery, office supplies, creative services and books for our libraries. We collect just 3.6% of the taxation, and yet we're responsible for 33% of the public infrastructure. We're extremely productive, extremely efficient, and when we work together, we can create real, meaningful, significant change. For example, in Sydney, we're working with the Hunter region in New South Wales to create a recycling circular economy. We take our glass that we collect from people's recycling bins, we ship it off to the Hunter, where we hope they will be able to turn it into road base that we will buy back to produce safe roads and better footpaths. 2 years ago, when the globalised economy was considered all upside and no risk, we could all send our waste offshore, but we could buy our road base offshore too. It turns out there are risks to thinking globally and forgetting the local. And a worldwide pandemic is, of course, a key risk. Working together, councils have come up with a solution that will help us keep our recycling here in New South Wales, provide a valuable, sustainable source of product, and of course, create clean, green jobs in the Hunter. Another example of councils working together to create enormous change is VECO. 46 of Victoria's 79 councils are part of the Victorian Energy Collaboration, with their electricity needs pooled into one long-term renewable energy contract. The emissions saved are the same as taking 90,000 cars off the road. Indeed, a recent report from ICLEI, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, revealed that if all the targets set by Australian local governments were met, an incredible 88,000 kilotonnes of carbon emissions would be reduced. This would achieve 96% of Australia's current emissions target of 28% by 2030. With a national program to help local governments deliver on our emissions reductions ambitions, there is a huge emissions reduction opportunity. An opportunity too to grow a roaring green economy and new jobs in every pocket of Australia. Local governments are flexible. We are collaborative and we are agile in ways that state and territory governments and our Commonwealth simply cannot be. We can be part of the solution for so many of the problems we face as a nation, whether it's coping with the pandemic, recovering from it, addressing climate change and climate change mitigation, supporting local businesses and closing the gap. Often, as with the example of the light bulb, we do one simple thing and it changes and fixes all of those problems at once. But to do this, we need the federal government to restore federal assistance grants to the level equal to that of at least 1% of Commonwealth taxation revenue, the level they were under the Keating government, the level they were when John Howard became the Prime Minister in 1996. The current level is closer to 0.5%, and it is not enabling us to drive a locally led recovery as effectively as we could. A fundamental part of our ask is to let the government know that we value funding. We don't just want a one-off grant. We don't just want a one-off funding injection. We need a funding increase to financial assistance grants that is recurrent, to give us confidence, to employ apprentices over multiple years, to invest in large public infrastructure projects and other things that can't be achieved with small one-off grant funding. We share the same ambitions to improve productivity, create prosperous and livable places, improve the quality of life for our communities, enhance community wellbeing and build social cohesion. We can be so much more of building a better, stronger, more resilient community. In fact, local governments are crucial to the heart of that project. All we need is recognition, a place at the table, and the funding to contribute so much more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech there, Linda. You obviously talked about picking up that point about the financial straitjacket that councils find themselves in. Are you always sort of, and talking from the financial review point of view, we're always obsessed a bit with tax reform and things like that, but local government never gets a look in that conversation at all. How do we sort of get councils into that conversation? Is there an opportunity around with things like we're seeing in New South Wales where the Treasurer there is looking at doing replacing stamp duty with a land tax, which obviously councils have had for years in the form of rates and things like that? Are there opportunities around that?
These are absolutely important opportunities that we are taking advantage of at the state level to engage with the conversation about tax reform. In New South Wales, where I come from, we certainly are talking to the Treasurer a lot about that particular reform and how it might have a substantial benefit for local governments. We know also, though, that tax reforms touted by state governments can hurt local government, and rate capping is the example of that. Unfortunately, rate capping, in effect now for decades in New South Wales and now in Victoria, has really put a very significant constraint on councils. And so if you look, for example, at the maintenance backlog on our infrastructure in New South Wales, it's far more significantly behind than any other state or territory who has not had rate capping in effect. At the national level, it is difficult to access the conversation about taxation reform, especially when local government isn't recognised in the Constitution and therefore has no proper legal role to engage in that constitutional debate about how we're funded. However, the federal assistance grants, that key grant program from the Commonwealth, is the way that we can revive local governments. It exists now. It was funded to 1% under the Keating government, and if restored to that level, it will make an enormous difference to the number of jobs we can create, an enormous difference to the number of libraries we can keep open, footpaths and bike paths we can build, parks we can keep clean and open during a pandemic when people need to be outside. And we hope, if we have a seat at the National Cabinet table, also to support the rollout of the vaccination.
How much would it cost to get back up to 1% of the federal assistance grants?
We currently receive around $2.5 billion per year from the Commonwealth Government. We're asking them to approximately double that, so over a 3-year period, 6.
So pretty modest.
Just a modest ask. But you've got to think of the public benefit that we get for that. As I said, we receive 3% of the tax take, responsible for 33% of the nation's infrastructure. We're talking about a very significant benefit in every corner of Australia. The other benefit of the federal assistance grants is that it's a very clear formula. It's very transparent and it's not done in a way that can be gerrymandered. And so every corner of Australia receives funding to boost their local communities in a way that is unable to be politically influenced. This is a very strong government program that should be expanded.
Okay, cool. All right, well, I'll turn to our journalist members here today for questions. And first one is Richard Ferguson.
Richard Ferguson from The Australian. Thank you for your speech. Councillor, you took a more than $11,000 loan before the last council elections, which you declared and repaid from a Mr. Yukshan Lee. Why did you take that loan and what were the circumstances around taking that loan?
It's really common for candidates in many different elections to take loans. For example, one of my state seat colleagues, Alex Greenwich, has also declared many loans, publicly disclosed, loan agreements, paid back. It's a very normal thing to do as part of a campaign. The City of Sydney has 200,000 people that live there, unlike, unfortunately, some of my colleagues here from remote and regional areas. Running election campaigns in the City of Sydney tends to be done with fundraising and donations, and so that was part of the process that we undertook.
So what about this particular loan, though? Because your fundraising costs were about more than $3,000, pretty much covered your election costs. $11,000 is... I know it's probably small in the world of politics, but it is quite a substantial amount of money. Can you tell us anything about this particular loan?
The public donation caps in the City of Sydney are in the order of, currently, about $75,000. Opposition candidates to me in the past have spent several $100,000. These were loans, they were declared in line with the law, they've been paid back. So you
can't tell us anything about why you took money from Mr. Lee?
I think I've answered the question, but thank you.
Well, I believe you want to run for Lord Mayor of Sydney, so why can't you discuss this particular loan? Is there a particular reason you can't discuss this particular loan?
I think I've answered the question. I have discussed it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks very much for the commentary there. We'll turn to Laura Tingle.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for your speech. I'm interested in the whole question of what happened post-COAG. So 2 things. One of them is, can you sort of explain to us what interactions local government now has with the federal government? What are your avenues for discussing all these things? And the second one is, we've seen federal government wander increasingly into areas of state and local government so that you have at least 5 or 6 cabinet ministers turning up to open a roundabout. And of course we have a lot of local community programs that are funded and sometimes controversially. Does that actually blur do you think, in the public's mind, what the role of federal, state and local governments are? And is that actually sort of a problem for local government in that people don't recognise the services that are actually provided by local governments?
It's a great question, thanks Laura, because I think it certainly is the case that communities often come to their council for absolutely every service of government. I certainly know I've been asked about everything from Medicare to providing support in a hospital to a range of other government activities from the Commonwealth and state government. People see local government as the level closest to their communities, as the government to go to seek solutions. It is, however, of course, also the case that local governments can do very little without any state or federal funding. Hence, when our federal and state colleagues go to the opening of a roundabout, it is more than likely they have all in some way at some point contributed in some way to that project. And certainly as mayors and councillors, we do like to ensure that we recognise those contributions, of course, so that we can apply and be successful to be funded again into the future. I think, however, not having a proper, secure funding stream for local governments does promote extraordinary confusion in the minds of the Australian public. It also does mean that we continue to have to ask Commonwealth and state governments to fund things that they perhaps are not normally known for funding. We welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has taken an interest in waste and recycling, typically an issue only associated with state and local governments. However, ensuring that the funding goes to the right place, meets the public need, actually increases recycling rather than just funding poorer waste and cleansing outcomes is really going to only work when local governments are funded to do that work properly.
We've seen the pandemic make premiers relevant again and popular. It's always state, whenever we talk about, abolishing a tier of government, states are always the ones in the firing line for it. Do you think with what we've seen during coronavirus, we are now stuck with the three levels of government, or do you think it is maybe worth having a discussion down the track about sort of proper reform if we're going to go down the constitutional recognition path, perhaps?
I'm confident that many of the mayors in the room would feel strongly about abolishing state governments, but I'm not going to throw my arrow into that debate. What we need now, though, more so than ever during a pandemic, is for all three levels of government to work together. During the pandemic, when we saw, for example, the Commonwealth Government announce they weren't going to pay JobKeeper to councils, and then in the same week announce parents wouldn't have to pay, simultaneously robbing local governments of every income stream for our childcare centres, having 500 childcare centres close overnight, often minding the children of the doctors and the nurses and the frontline workers who were running Australia's response to the pandemic, was incredibly problematic. Had ALGA had a seat at the National Cabinet table, this problem could have absolutely been avoided. We then saw a response from the Commonwealth and New South Wales government announcing 2 childcare rescue packages on the same day. Also unhelpful because they clearly hadn't spoken to each other before announcing those packages. Now, it was a pandemic. People were working hard. We don't judge them for that, and we're grateful for the support. But this is about coordinating what we all do and ensuring we don't overlap. And a seat at the National Cabinet, meeting regularly, functioning well, will allow local government to feed in that local knowledge that will get those other state and federal government programs to work. We do the work in partnership with state and federal governments on the ground. And without that collaboration, big sectors fall over. We can't have that now.
Nick Stewart.
Here in Canberra, we're not used to politicians getting applauded. When you stood up and Andrew introduced you, there was actually quite a wave of positiveness around the room. Is that because you managed to identify a common enemy, the federal government? But secondly, more importantly, we've seen, of course, an increasing way in which federal politicians give grants to their electorates. They choose, for example, a particular sports field which needs an upgrade or something like that. Would you like to see that money quarantined so that it was then transferred to local governments, so that local governments could choose the areas that are most in need of funding and proper resourcing?
Look, the Commonwealth Government is not our enemy. They are our major partner. Without the federal assistance grants, that untied funding scheme that is provided transparently according to a formula, councils simply couldn't operate. Indeed, during the pandemic, and many people would find this difficult to believe, many local governments were so close to being financially unsustainable, they were almost about to have to close their doors. Indeed, we have seen some councils really getting extremely close to being that financially unsustainable. And we've seen in Queensland the Auditor-General calling out the high number of Queensland councils that are financially unsustainable. If you ran the same pencil over many local governments across the nation, you're likely to see a very similar result. What we need is security and consistency of transparent funding. We absolutely understand that Commonwealth parliamentarians and state parliamentarians love grants. They love to open roundabouts. They love to be seen to be doing things by their communities. But providing funding in that way into the future will see a number of our local governments, 537 of them in Australia, go broke. This is not a sustainable outcome for an entire tier of government in Australia.
Talking about councils going broke, though, I mean, it begs the question about how big should councils get with mergers and things like that. As a former long-time resident of the New South Wales Central Coast and a young reporter who cut their teeth covering Gosford Council, the former Gosford Council, we've seen the financial troubles they're running up to there. Around the ACT here, we've got some of the local shires wanting to de-amalgamate Gundagai, Cootamundra, for instance, another area close to my home, close to where I used to live. So what is the ideal size for a council, particularly around this issue of financial sustainability?
It's a great question. The whole point is there is no ideal size. Merging 3 financially unsustainable councils leads to one large, less financially sustainable council. And unfortunately, in the case of the Central Coast in New South Wales, that's exactly what we've seen. Indeed, in the case of many of the New South Wales council mergers, the Deputy Premier just, I think last week, acknowledged that that was an error of government policy. The government's own modelling showed that councils may only financially benefit from those decisions after a 10-year period, and with a pandemic financial shock in the middle of that decade, it's perhaps unsurprising, although incredibly devastating, to see the financial troubles that the Central Coast Council is in. There's no doubt that a policy from state governments of forced council mergers create extraordinary political opposition. Cootamundra Gundagai continues to have an enormous debate with their fantastic Mayor, Ab McAllister, about that many, many years later. The other case, of course, is when councils collaborate, and I've cited numerous examples today of councils across borders working together on major procurement projects, major infrastructure projects. These are things that councils do together to be efficient, more productive, and create strong community benefit. But strong, politically enforced council mergers and border changes tend to really produce, not everywhere, but often, far poorer results for communities.
Tom Connell.
Tom Connell from Sky News. I wanted to ask you about recycling. The federal government has some sort of more ambitious targets in the future. It talks about technology and more high-tech processing. But how much of the problem is us? I live in an apartment. The recycle bin astonishes me. It's like a low-grade sort of Vinnie's bin. You see old suitcases and children's toys and shoes and everything in soft plastic, which it shouldn't be, just in case anyone's wondering. How much of a problem is us, the voters, about recycling? How much do we need to change around, I don't know, public awareness campaigns, whatever it might be?
Well, thanks, Tom, for being a recycling advocate. Good for you. We've gotten a public message about recycling today. There's no doubt that so much of what we can do to reduce waste is about behaviour, and so community campaigns that continue to educate people about where to put waste is going to be the main predictor of success. We have long advocated to states that they take their waste levies. Many states and territories collect waste levies. In New South Wales, we collect nearly $800 million a year. We pass that directly from our ratepayers straight onto the state, and they reinvest back into councils around 17%, the remainder going to consolidated revenue. There's enormous waste levy connection in our state and territory governments that could be repurposed to recycling and waste education to prevent so much soft plastic that can of course be reused, recycling and other materials from being repurposed. Also though, we need the spend. And that's the example I cited in Sydney. We are trying to create a circular economy ourselves with our own procurement to create a market value for the product that is being repurposed. We need other levels of government to have very clear procurement targets for recycled goods. This is the way to create a truly circular economy, reduce our waste, use our waste in other ways and buy it back.
Thank you. Jessica Davis.
Just have to stand up a little bit higher. Linda, many rural and regional women, but women all across the country, were fairly dismayed at what happened in Canberra yesterday. We've had the light shone on federal politics over the course of this entire year on sexual harassment and women in politics. But this isn't just a problem in federal politics, this is also a problem in local council. New South Wales has one of the lowest representation of women, under 30%. A Victorian report last year found that 43% of women councillors had experienced sexual harassment. How do local councils tackle this issue?
It's a great question. This year, we've looked so closely at women in life generally, but particularly women in public life, and how important it is to have gender equality in all our political establishments. It's really great to be here with today. I think she's here with the President of the Australian Local Government Women's Association, Marianne Saliba, and there's various state and territory bodies that are doing extraordinarily good work to support women, both elected and council staff, to ensure that that gender balance improves. It certainly is the case, for example, in Victoria, where they've had a very concentrated strategy of education over a number of years and some very strong women leaders, that we now have a woman on every local government in Victoria. That is not matched by every other state or territory. If you can't look around a table of elected people and see the faces that represent your community, then your government is arguably not thinking as much about the problems that your communities face. And at a very practical level of government, such as local government, this is incredibly important. I remember when I was first elected, for example, my son had only recently been born. I was not able to access childcare. There were waiting lists of hundreds of children at every centre. One of the major reasons I ran for council was to see the city invest and support more childcare. We now have 6 new centres as a result. We know that councils understand the changing demographics of their areas and can support communities, but without people at the table who are understanding and experiencing those issues, it's perhaps not something that receives the right political attention it deserves.
How do you deal with the issue of bullying, though? I've seen this in lots of local councils across the country, that there's a culture where lots of older men are involved and there tends to be a lot of bullying in local councils.
I'm not sure that the level of bullying in local government would be any different from the very high level of bullying in many workplaces. And I have been elected as the New South Wales and national president off the back of a lot of support from some of those gentlemen that you mention. So I think it is the case that unfortunately every industry and politics and local government is not isolated from that, has a problem with bullying. It's really important to call it out, to have great strong associations that support their members to ensure that they are looked after and supported. But it's absolutely a problem. We absolutely are very transparent about that, and we try to encourage professional development, education, and support for people when they're elected or when they're working in our local governments.
Thank you. Our next questioner is Tim Shaw.
Linda, Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. Thanks for your address today. Can you turn your mind to local government areas in rural and regional Australia? Many of the mayors here today. The food bowl of Australia is in those communities. What steps are ALGA and, of course, those rural and regional councils doing to improve upskilling and training to retain that workforce, particularly in the food industry? For example, there's over 250,000 people that work in food production in Australia, of which 108,000 are in regional and rural communities. What is ALGA doing? What policy settings are you considering? And then is that part of your mechanism to National Cabinet and to state governments? What steps are ALGA taking to retain those jobs and to increase food production without the red or green tape from local government?
Thanks, Tim. Well, as you can imagine, so many of our mayors and councillors in regional areas are themselves primary producers, and so, of course, have a deep understanding of both the problems of Australia's future food security, but also having presumably dealt with the local government themselves before they were elected, a direct experience of the local government regulations that you talk about.
Yeah.
Local governments have a responsibility, of course, in having regulation to keep our communities safe, whether it's in the metropolitan areas to support the safe standard of building and development, or in the regional areas by ensuring, for example, that people aren't building homes in floodplains and a range of other things. But because we represent such a large number of regional councils, it is a vitally important piece of work that we continue to do. In the current National Cabinet structure, we are represented on the National Federation Reform Council with the Prime Minister, the Premiers and the Treasurer. And we also work closely with the former Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm sure we'll work closely with the current Deputy Prime Minister and a range of the state relevant regional ministers on this issue. I was recently in Tasmania, for example, at a regional subcommittee meeting with all those relevant regional, federal and state ministers talking about workforce development, talking about a whole range of issues to ensure that Australia's food bowls are safe. We have staff there who are skilled and can work there. In fact, though, as a result of the pandemic, we're seeing the opposite trend than we've seen. That is that regional Australians are not leaving regional Australia to move to the cities. They're staying. And indeed, there is some evidence that if there were not such an acute housing shortage, many people from capital cities would be moving to regional areas. So we see this as a great opportunity to see further moves towards decentralisation. This is something that councils, both metropolitan and regional, support. But again, this cannot be done by 537 local governments coordinating ourselves together. We do that well. We need to ensure that the strategies to house people, to educate them, to think about where and how they'll be employed, all these things are done in collaboration with state and federal governments, which is, of course, why we want to be on the National Cabinet.
If I may, Andrew, just in terms of the workforce, what is the ALGA feeling regarding the larger number of workers coming in from those 10 Asian countries that were outlined, Myanmar, Thailand? Are you in a position in those primary production areas to be able to cater to that extraordinarily diverse workforce?
Look, as you can imagine, in local government, we try to stay out of issues of immigration. As I said, free trade agreements, the like. It will be a different impact in different areas. And what we can do, though, to inform that debate is provide information to the Commonwealth and state government about the impacts of those changes and ensure that that information is getting to them so they can make the right decisions.
Thank you very much.
Dale Keane from East Arnhem Council, welcome to Canberra. Hope you packed your jacket.
Thank you. I must say I'm more used to holding the mic than doing it like this. But congratulations, Linda, on your election as President. I think you got the support of the room because we recognise your commitment over these many years to something that is really the closest form of government to the ground local government. So I'd just like to make that comment. But the first thing I'd like to comment on is that I think it's quite an historic resolution, and thank you all the other local governments here in this room and back in the convention centre about this recognition of Aboriginal councils, Aboriginal controlled councils around Australia for the first time. So in closing the gap in the middle of last year, we had back proper recognition for ALGA and local government at a national level for closing the gap and working together. And logically from that, if you get to the actual community, the councils that are closest to the ground, of course, the actual local government councils, I think that's a fantastic step forward. And so we thank you for your support on that, and everyone from Combat Scarlett, the Lord Mayor of Darwin, and our Legant leader, our Legant president, all the way through to Moonee Valley, and we've had many people this week, and all the city and municipal councils. So in terms of that, what I'm interested in is and reflecting on the fact that we also had a meeting with Minister White yesterday, led by our Deputy President, Dwalpi Marika, sitting to the rear, and Bundy Wanamara, one of our councillors from Gapawea. And he talked through with the Minister, and we were pleased that the Minister was receptive as he talked through and how our council already, like many councils that are Aboriginal, is based on traditional structure. Our electoral wards are called Gatchak, Miwach, Anandiliakwa, Rabalwang for a reason, because they're based on the traditional lands and the traditional clan structures and where they divide and where they join. And then we have local authorities, like many of the councils in the Northern Territory. We have 9, some have 13, Jeff McLeod, McDonald, and each of those we treat with the respect of a council, and we listen to everything they say, and it goes to council, and we advocate on that behalf. So based on that and that good response that we had from Minister Wyatt, I just wanted to ask your view about your level of confidence with and working through with the federal government and the respective Northern Territory and state governments about the success of real voice from the people in Aboriginal community controlled councils.
Thanks for the question, Dale, and thanks so much to those of you from East Arnhem who've travelled so far to be in Canberra. It's really magnificent. Dale, I always feel very confident that the Commonwealth Government is going to listen and work with us. We represent 537 councils, every corner of the nation. Any federal government would be unwise not to listen to us and work with us. I think it is clearly recognised by so many in Australia that particularly in the Northern Territory, particularly in some of our most remote parts of the nation, where we have wonderful, functioning, extremely successful Aboriginal local governments, that providing them with access to funding streams that are run for Aboriginal controlled organisations is a logical thing to do. So I'm very hopeful and confident that the Commonwealth Government will agree to your request, will agree to indeed now the request on the basis of the fact that our conference has unanimously adopted that call. I think it is also the case that councils across the nation recognise that Aboriginal councils, as part of the Closing the Gap strategy, deserve recognition, that all councils deeply want to be part of that Closing the Gap process to ensure that we're all finding ways to support our First Nations Australians who live in almost every local government in Australia. So thanks for the question, Dale.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Rightio. Well, I think that's time, so let's leave it all there. Could everyone in the room please thank Linda Scott, and those of you watching at the Convention Centre also do the same.
Thank you. Thanks very
And
much.
you don't go away empty-handed.
Oh.
Membership of the Press Club.
Great.
The main game, Linda's a member of the Press Club now. The main game with that, as you all know, it gets her free parking if she ever comes back to Canberra. So very handy. So
I'll just have to declare that now to sort of... Thank you very much. It's been an honour. Thank you.
Gonna-